So I've known Colin since then. I also went to abstractions, and I've been, kind of kicking around, doing various things in Pittsburgh. But mostly busy writing a book and doing the things of being an assistant professor, which I'm happy to talk about if anybody's curious about that. My background is in English. You see that I am an assistant professor of English, not of computer science. My background is in literacy studies, so I am very interested in how people read and write and how reading and writing circulates in the world, both historically and in contemporary ways. I'm also very interested in digital stuff, how literacy is embedded in the ways that we produce lots of things, right? That's not just straight up text, but images and videos and programming, like all kind of mixed in together. We have a fantastic composition instrument here that is both a reading and writing machine, right? And you can do lots of things that are not just writing text. So that's the kind of stuff that I study, not necessarily like K through 12 education, how people learn to read, but those kinds of things historically. So my hope in the talk, I assume you read the abstract if you're here, but I'm going to talk a little bit about coding as a literacy, the kind of rhetoric around, everyone should learn to code, and a little bit about the history of literacy and the history of programming, and the history of kind of people promoting coding literacy. And my hope is that knowing something about the histories and context of these things may be interesting to you. At the very least, I hope, you're here. Maybe a water cooler talk at your workplace. Also, perhaps help you think about how you code and how you write, how you learned and how you teach these things to other people, and what it might mean for the future of programming, what it might mean for you, integrating these skills in your own life. So so yes, and thank you to Justin and Colin and Code and Supply for having me here. I am as local as you can get. I live like 3 blocks from here, so this is a really nice place for me to come. I can just waltz down and, all right, by the sharp edge. As I said, my background is in literacy studies, but I'm a child of the 80s, so fellow children of 80s or earlier, you may recognize Logo and Basic up here. I learned Logo and Basic in as much as one can do that when they're 8 to 10 years old or so, as part of the Beat the Russians campaign, etc., and American elementary schools in the 1980s. And I also, after I graduated with my English degree, I had a fancy English degree, and I had trouble finding a job. And so I worked for a little while as a secretary at Raven Software in Madison, Wisconsin, which you may know from Call of Duty expansion pack sort of things now. But I was there much earlier, and then that's when I kind of reconnected with my sort of interest in computers, and being a secretary was super boring, so I did IT and lots of other things then after I was there for a little while. So that's my background, and then I ended up kind of, when I was in graduate school at University of Wisconsin-Madison, I kind of put this whole background behind me. I'm learning about literacy. I'm, learning to be a professor, et cetera, hopefully. And what I started realizing is, in the conversations about literacy in my classes, they reminded me a lot of what I had heard the programmers that I worked with at Raven talking about kinds of composition and writing and mind expansion and creativity and all sorts of things like that. And so I started kind of making these connections between what programming was and what literacy was. And then ultimately, finally, wrote a book, and it takes a really long time for a book to come out. So anyway, okay, so I want to start with a video that you may or may not have seen before. How many of you guys have heard of Code.org? Okay, most people. So you may or may not have seen this video, but I'll show it to you now. It's just 2 minutes long.
Software and computers. It used to be that was just kind of a separate area of the world, but now software touches all these different things that you use.
I think if you look at everything, I mean,
Okay, so you heard it's called coding or Code the New Literacy. But you heard all the reading and writing, right? That kind of rhetoric happening. And this is sort of an undercurrent in a lot of the talk about how everyone should learn to code, right? We all know how to read and write. What would it be like if we all knew how to code as well? And this is, you guys have probably seen this a number of different places. It's hard to escape. When I started working on this project, I was like, but now it seems like it's everywhere. So it was good timing for me. But there's a lot of different groups that are working on this, not just Code.org. Code.org is, was founded in 2013 by Mark Zuckerberg by Hallie and Adi Partovi, but it's been supported by Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, who are featured in there. And so they've had a lot of, kind of big support and money, which is why you guys have all heard of them. But there's also Code Academy, Black Girls Code, Yes We Code. There's Robots for Coding. Lego Mindstorms you may have heard of, which is referring to Seymour Papert, who I'll talk about later. Games for Coding. Alice, which was developed locally here at CMU. Scratch at MIT, which is a little more popular. And then Obama also did a computer science for all kind of thing and was promoting code as well. So there's a lot of these different kinds of initiatives, right? There's also been a lot of talk about it. Douglas Rushkoff, who is a kind of popular cultural commentator, wrote this book, Program or Be Programmed. And he says that programming gives people access to the control panel of civilization, and that if we don't learn to program, we'll be programmed. Pop educational theorist Mark Prensky, and this is the guy who did Digital Natives and Digital Immigrants, which you may have heard of, which I have some problems with. But anyway, pop culture education guy says, as programming becomes more important, it will leave the back room and become a key skill and attribute of our top intellectual and social classes, just as reading and writing did in the past. In support of a major educational initiative that included a computer science for all program in New York City public schools, Mayor Bill de Blasio said, a computer science education is literacy for the 21st century. And more recent, proving that this does cross political boundaries, Ivanka Trump was also promoting coding education and has been kind of trying to throw her weight around it. And then released this somewhat cryptic tweet as part of a video supporting it. So code as a new literacy is kind of everywhere right now. It's crossing politics. It's people are talking about it, right? Why is everybody suddenly promoting the idea that everybody should learn to code? So I don't need to tell you in this room, I'm sure, that our communications and relationships and commerce and livelihoods are all structured by code. So people are talking about how important it is to learn coding from a defensive standpoint, on the one hand. So as Vanessa said in that video, if you don't know how to code, you could be a victim of other people's choices. And this is also the Rushkoff kind of rhetoric too. You're programmed or you be programmed, right? You can either be active in this or passive. So coding is pretty important to the infrastructure of our lives, but it is also generating a lot of jobs and revenue right now, which is probably also not something that I have to tell you guys here, right? This is the angle that President Obama took in his Computer Science for All initiative, which he announced in his final State of the Union address. So this was part of the publicity for it. So this is what the White House said about that initiative at that time. Computer Science for All is the president's bold new initiative to empower all American students from kindergarten through high school to learn computer science and be equipped with the computational thinking skills they need to be creators in the digital economy, not just consumers, to be active citizens in our technology-driven world. Our economy is rapidly shifting, and both educators and business leaders are increasingly recognizing that computer science is a new basic skill necessary for economic opportunity and social mobility. So notice in all of these things the emphasis on economy, citizenship, and its connection to basic skills. These are all kind of literacy things here, and they don't mention literacy per se in the Obama thing here, but literacy rates are often cited as also as important factors in a country's economic health. So literacy is often talked about as a factor for social mobility, good citizenship. So this promotion for the initiative is tapping into the same kinds of rhetoric of literacy, although it doesn't say so explicitly, like the Code.org video does. So increasing infrastructural reliance on code as well as a need to strengthen our economy are two reasons coding is being promoted right now. And there's another reason, and that is programming is done by a narrow segment of the population. As the White House blog post later points out, people who tend to program tend to come from certain populations. People who program tend to be people who have access to computers and mentors to turn to early in life. So how many of you guys had access to a computer, I don't know, before you were 12, before puberty? Most people in this room, right? And I'm not going to make women raise their hands, but there's more men than, from my perspective, I can see right here, there's more men than women in this room, for instance. Okay, so if you've ever done a Google search of programmers, try it. This is what they look like. Who's missing here? Everybody except for the white guys, right? And these are just, representations of it, right? But this is what we all assume that programmers are and look like. So some of the initiatives I'm talking about today are trying to tackle a problem with diversity among the people who make software, and they're achieving some degree of success. So here's some bragging by Codeorg, where they are, they have 43% female students, 37% Black and Hispanic students. This is pretty darn good for computer science. And it's too soon to know now, though, what's going to happen to these young people once they grow up. As we know, like the numbers for Silicon Valley right now are abysmal. There's a lot of, maybe Codeorg will change things. I'm not sure. But so as I'm sure I don't need to tell you, women are grossly underrepresented in computer science degrees. So this is interesting because you see, 1970, very few women majoring in or going to medical school, law school, physical science, etc., or computer science. But notice that computer science is the outlier here, that women peaked in 1984 and then decreased and, now seem to be plateaued a little bit, but have followed a different trend from all of those other initially male-dominated fields. So, it used to be the case, World War II, prior to World War II, if you said computer, I need a computer to do something, you meant a human. You meant somebody who would actually do some math for you. And often those humans were women, because they were women who had gotten math degrees, for instance, which tended to be a little bit more generous about women and employing women than, say, the engineering or sciences. And so, as we know from the movie Hidden Figures, I don't know if anybody has seen that, but so women did okay in math in terms of representation-ish. And so when the computers were being developed in World War II, the men were often the engineers. They would sort of design things from above, and then the women would be the ones actually plugging the wires and debugging. So these are WRENs, W-R-N-S, I forget what it stands for, but they call them WRENs, operating the Colossus during World War II in the UK, which was classified, I think, until like the 1970s maybe. So these women couldn't even talk about their work code breaking for World War II, which was very important for the Allies' strategy. They couldn't even talk about it with their husbands. So ENIAC was not classified. ENIAC was here in the United States, and these are some of the programmers for the ENIAC. In 1968, this is an awesome article about how you can get a great job as a computer girl. You can make decent money, and it's not as discriminatory as other jobs. So that was the pitch that Cosmo made to their readers in 1968. And then, of course, Hidden Figures, if you've seen that, I recommend it. It's, not necessarily about computing somewhat, but you notice that one of the people then was running the computer pool at the end, right? Because she was like teaching herself Fortran. If you're interested in the history of women in computing, I'm happy to talk about it and give you resources. But here's a number of books on the history of it. And some really interesting stuff. That book in the bottom left, Unlocking the Clubhouse, Women in Computing, is actually about CMU. They interviewed a whole bunch of women who went to college at CMU in the 1990s, I think like exactly when I would have been in college too, and why they were dropping out of computer science. To CMU's credit, they have done a lot of things to remedy that, and CMU actually has much better representation with women than most. Pitt does not. So that's a problem for another day, I suppose. So, given this history of women in computing, perhaps it's possible to at least get back to where we were in the 1940s or the 1960s or the 1980s. But Code.org and Scratch and the other groups aren't just talking about getting more women and underrepresented groups into computer programming and computer science. They're also talking about mass coding literacy. So what are the chances of that happening? And I want to say that mass literacy was also similarly ambitious. Reading and writing is hard. I mean, if any of you have, small children, you watch them kind of learn these things. It's a very exciting thing to do, but writing is also very hard. So, and yet, this is the according to the World Factbook, almost 90% of men and 80% of women in the world can read and write by the time at a basic level, by the time they're 8 and 15. So literacy levels still vary widely across different groups. I don't know if you can see here, but Afghanistan, the numbers are pretty low. If you go down to Antigua and Argentina, the numbers are pretty high. And the numbers in the United States match more the Argentina and industrialized countries. So the worldwide literacy rate is around 85%, but it's 95% in industrialized countries. So pretty good, right? So even if it's distributed unevenly, especially across men and women still, basic reading and writing, the dream of mass literacy has largely come true. So maybe there's something to this idea of literacy that people are using in order to kind of connect these ideas and try to promote programming. So because these campaigns tap into the concept of mass literacy, I want to take a few minutes to look at the history of mass literacy. So what kinds of values were associated with literacy as it spread, how literacy campaigns worked, and what they achieved. The values and motivations attached to mass literacy have shifted over time, and as I'll show later, we can see how some of these values then get kind of absorbed into the coding literacy movement. So you guys ready for a little history? I'll be real fast. Literacy began as a religious virtue, a way for individuals to connect directly with God. Protestants believed that one needed to read the Bible to connect with God, rather than going through a priest as a mediator, like Catholicism had always done. So beginning with Martin Luther and the Protestant movement in 16th century Europe, the belief in the necessity of reading the Bible for salvation connected reading to morality. So as these French historians say, by making reading a spiritual obligation, Luther made necessary what Gutenberg made possible. And by that, these historians mean that Protestantism made it necessary to read the books that Johannes Gutenberg's late 15th century printing press had enabled. So here's a little woodcut of the printing press in 1450. So once books were a little more available, and once the Protestant Reformation had established literacy as a moral good, the Catholic Church was also kind of roped in. So this was the game that they were going to play now. Here's the grounds that they're going to fight for souls. So the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church then both had to kind of promote literacy. And for both of them, literacy became a moral and a spiritual good. So we still see this legacy of moral goodness in reading now, right? Reading is good, and unlike most other things in education, pretty much everyone believes that reading is good, right? You don't see like anti-reading campaigns, anti-literacy campaigns. It's funny, right? It's funny to even think about it. But of course, like it's deeply good for kids to learn how to read. And this is where it came from. So in the 17th and 18th century, literacy was increasingly important, not just for spiritual salvation, but also for business and government. So people could still get by without it, but craftsmen sometimes wrote invoices for their work. People read newspapers and pamphlets. They wrote letters and notes to each other. They signed contracts, and news circulated in writing. But there weren't very many formal schools and no public schools until the 19th century. Yet, by the time of compulsory schooling in 1876 in England, the population was already 75% literate. So where were people learning to read and write? In the 17th and 18th century. So usually they learned from their churches, they learned from poor itinerant teachers, they learned from their families, from their mothers, or they paid other people to teach it to them. So writing was tougher to do and less commonly taught, in part because of the supplies needed, fine motor control, Just the technologies of writing in the 17th and 18th century. But reading was much more common. And once people knew how to read or write, there were lots of opportunities to put their skills to work in the 17th and 18th century by writing letters and notes, by reading news and things like that. Text was everywhere, and people had all sorts of ways of learning how to understand and produce it. So literacy was still connected to morality at this time, but it had a lot of diverse values attached to it because it was learned and practiced in so many different areas of life. This was before it was formalized. So, here's the Dutch schoolmaster. This is the poor itinerant teacher. So in the 19th century, in North America, Britain, and much of Western Europe, the meaning of literacy shifted. It retained its moral goodness, but literacy became good for civic rather than spiritual reasons. So by the latter half of the 19th century in America, literacy had come to be associated with progress not only of your soul, but also of the modern state. And this is the age of mass schooling, when states began to provide free public schools and compel kids to go to them. And especially in America, public schooling and literacy became kind of merged and thought that it was necessary for educated citizens for democracy, right? You needed to be literacy in order to make decisions about your government. So for the state, literacy came to be an indication of the civic and moral and economic contributions of individual citizens to the nation. And once literacy became nationally valuable in the middle of the 19th century, illiteracy then became not just a personal problem, but a social problem, not just a spiritual problem, but a problem for the entire country. So literacy then began to be measured in conjunction with educational policy, and the state began to quite literally count on individual literacy as a collective economic and social resource. So the first study of illiteracy in the United States was conducted in 1870 in conjunction with educational policy. And around World War I in the United States, the measuring of literacy became much more systematic when they were enlisting soldiers with the use of standardized tests for recruits. So these tests were influenced by French psychologist Alfred Binet's intelligence tests. You may have taken one of these tests, right? The SAT, for instance, is influenced by this, comes directly out of this heritage. So literacy had become interesting to measure because so much had been ascribed to it. Moral goodness and patriotism and lower criminality and even better hygiene was ascribed to literacy. So governments thought that literacy could do all sorts of things to people, and so then this was then used to justify public schooling. And the merging of literacy and formal schooling is important because later I want to make a point about it with the contemporary coding campaigns. So the replacement of the religious model of literacy with the civic model also coincided with a transition to the industrial economy in the 19th century. The schooled and literate workers were more amenable to the emerging factory model because early mass education fostered patriotism and respect for authority rather than critical or original thought necessarily. So you picture a 19th century school, right? All the kids' desks are in rows. They're listening dutifully to their teachers. It's totally different now, right? That's about the same. In this 19th century, schooling and literacy were joint strategies to tame the baser elements of society and as well as to foster the industrial economy. So in this history, you can see that morality has been the ideological linchpin for literacy since Luther. Morality was first connected to religion, but then it was transferred to the state with the rise of mass education in the 19th century. But in the mid-20th century, that dominant ideology changed. It changed from morality to technology. So although we still equate reading with goodness, like in those read posters, right, literacy is now more about efficiency, production, information manipulation, than moral connections to God or the nation. So during World War II, America still depended on citizens' literacy like they did in the 19th century, but this dependency was heightened and focused more on writing and technology than on reading and morality. So, as literacy researcher Deborah Brandt says, literacy goes from being good to being a good, something to be counted and traded. World War II was an information war and required contributions by soldiers and citizens alike. So the literacy skills of soldiers thus became assets to be used by the military, and illiteracy became grounds for rejection from the military. So they had one of these for all the enlisters. You may recognize this as early computer technology, right? And around this time, literacy became less about the absorption of information and more about knowledge production. So literacy was about writing more than reading, and technology over morality. The increased emphasis on writing, production, and technology are all connected at this time. And this is where we can start to see the roots of the Coding for Everyone movement, which is conveniently sort of around the same time that actual electronic computers are being developed, right, in World War II. So technology, especially computer technology, moved really fast during World War II. And the speed and progress of technologies in World War II shaped how literacy was measured and taught because of the increased demand of wartime information processing. Both writing and computation were critical communication strategies. And in this way, I think programming could be absorbed into the new, more technology and production-driven concept of literacy. The technologies of programming and writing then began to be linked in their connection to literacy as national strategies of defense and productivity around World War II. So here's another interesting way that programming and writing became connected just after World War II. So here we go again. We see the picture of Bletchley Park again. So this is the Mark I and the Colossus computer. The earliest mechanical and electronic computers, and all computers made before World War II, were more closely related to ship navigation instruments, machines of industrial production like the Jacquard loom. They were, machines that you would put the wires across, right? And each new calculation required rewiring the machine, essentially making the computer a special purpose machine for each new situation. And these computers were used for massive mathematical calculations, primarily like missile defense, physics, calculated ballistic trajectories for weapons, things like that. So in 1945, John von Neumann led a team to develop the stored program concept. How many of you guys have heard of this part of history? Okay. Which meant that it was a very famous, you can Google this and read it if you want, first draft of a report on the EDVAC. It's maybe one of the most famous first drafts, which it meant that the computer's program could be stored in memory rather than having the computer reconfigured every time somebody wanted to calculate something. So that's a huge difference, right? That meant that computers could be general purpose machines. That means that they could have many different calculations running without being physically manipulated. So programming became the manipulation of code rather than plugging in wires, and computer code became a symbolic text that was part of a writing system. So in other words, after World War II, computers became technologies of writing as well as engineering. And there's Fortran. So, coding for everyone. Here's a sort of, I'm going to switch channels here and continue going with some history. A few years later, we see the beginning of the Coding for Everyone movement, which from its very beginning connects programming to writing. So in 1959, George Forsyth, who was a mathematician at Stanford, and at this time, computer science came out of primarily math in the 1950s. He argued that all undergraduates should learn to work with automatic computers, which at that time meant programming them probably in Fortran. Carnegie Tech computation director Alan Perlis, who somebody you may have heard of, popularized this argument in 1960 when he argued for a freshman computer appreciation course that involved programming. The next year at a conference at MIT called, can you guys run a conference like this at some point again, called Computers and the World of the Future? Yes, please. Perlis, I have the book from it and everything. It's awesome. Perlis again argued that all undergraduates should be taught programming just as they are taught writing in their first-year composition courses. Now, I'm somebody who teaches first-year composition because I'm in an English department, so this is very interesting to me to see this parallel. So this is Perlis here. And he said, the first student contact with the computer should be at the earliest time possible in the student's freshman year. This contact should be analytical and not purely descriptive, and each student during his first course should program and run, or have run for him, a large number of problems on the computer. This course could share with mathematics and English the responsibility of developing an operational literacy. In a liberal arts program, the course could be delayed until the sophomore year, but certainly deserves inclusion in such a program because of the universal relevance of the computer to our times. This is 1961. So here we see him connecting programming to literacy and to the first-year writing course. By making these connections, he argues that the computer is so important that we really need to teach freshmen how to use it, even liberal arts freshmen. So Perlis's vision is particularly striking, of course, given the state of computers at the time. In 1961, it would have all been mainframes, right? And only a handful of college campuses would have had a computer on their campus. But as Perlis's argument suggests, computers were increasingly important to large-scale business and government, including defense, and his emphasis on broad undergraduate education in programming suggested that future leaders and citizens of America, or as Will.i.am says, citizens of the world, right, should know something about these machines. To me, this sounds a little bit like the democratic arguments for literacy in the 19th century, right? There's like a civic responsibility here. So Perlis's vision was at least partially realized with the BASIC programming language, which was designed at Dartmouth in the early 1960s by math professors John Kemeny and Thomas Kurtz. And I want to say, just as a side note, that I met Thomas Kurtz last week. He's still around. He's 89 years old, and he is sharp. And I was really excited to meet him. I traveled to Dartmouth to talk with him about this. Kemeny is unfortunately long gone, and I can talk about them if you guys are interested. But anyway, I'm doing a side project on the history of BASIC. So like Perlis, Kemeny and Kurtz saw the computer as universally relevant, and they designed BASIC to be accessible to all undergraduates, including liberal arts students, not just those in engineering and the hard sciences. And they were concerned that the future leaders trained at Dartmouth should know something about computation, given its increasing role in national infrastructure. So BASIC, of course, was successful. I mean, has anybody not heard of BASIC? You may not have actually programmed in BASIC, but you've probably heard of it. By the 1968 fall term, 80% of Dartmouth undergraduates plus several hundred faculty had learned how to write computer programs, 1968. And because Kemeny and Kurtz made BASIC free, it spread across college campuses in the 1960s and has enjoyed, of course, a long life afterwards as well. How many of you guys have ever written a program in BASIC? Okay, yeah. That's some circulation, right? Efforts to teach programming broadly were focused on undergraduates in the 1960s, in part because that's where you could find computers, right? You could also find them in government offices and major corporations. You also can see them in some select high school students as part of the experimental new math pedagogy. And as the technology and culture of computing spilled out from college campuses in the 1970s and west towards California, the impetus to promote programming to the masses seems to have gone in the same direction. So in the 1970s, you get West Coast initiatives with like kind of post-1960s San Francisco area politics, hobbyists and hackers, typified by the Homebrew Computer Club, People's Computer Company, Ted Nelson's manifesto, Computer Lib Dream Machines. How many of you guys are familiar with this book? It's like the weirdest thing, yeah. Anyway, I have a friend who has like an original copy of it, this is a scan that Pitt did for me. So anyway, mass programming took on a vibe of liberation and individual empowerment. So the mass programming movement went mainstream in the 1980s when computers became cheaper and easier to use and ubiquitous. So this is a great spread from Scientific American around the same time, which I love. Like, here's this guy, the computer for the professional, and then on the other side, start your own revolution with a personal computer. This is like this weird sort of Janus-faced, like in the early 1980s, what it looked like for computers to be kind of on the edge of this professional and liberatory sort of space. So the Commodore 64, which I had one at my house, the Apple II, and other commercially available machines that heralded the home computer revolution didn't require assembly like the hobbyist machines of the 1970s. So here's the Apple II. This was also from Scientific American. Note the woman gazing lovingly at the man on the kitchen table, programming. And note how many more words they used to use to advertise things, right? Totally different design. Apple, incidentally, would not let me put this in my book because of some BS. But I really wanted to have this reprinted in my book, but they wouldn't let me. Many adults saw their workplaces restructured to accommodate computers. Computer science was a popular undergraduate major, and by 1984, movies like War Games and Tron showcased the strategic and entertainment possibilities of the computer. Using computers of the 1980s usually meant programming them to some degree or interacting with BASIC at the very least. That's what it looks like, right, on the Apple IIe. And when computers went mainstream, they shed much of the hobbyist vibe. Computers were less about political empowerment and counterculture and more about educational opportunity and workplace efficiency. In the 1980s, affordable and easy-to-use home computers meant that for the first time, computers became accessible to kids. The idea of computers as tools for kids owes much to the educational research done in the 1970s, especially by Seymour Papert and Alan Kay. So this is Seymour Papert. He developed the Logo programming language in the UK and piloted it in classrooms in the late 60s and 70s. How many of you guys programmed in Logo? Okay, awesome. And at Xerox PARC in the 1970s, Alan Kay led a team of researchers to prototype the Dynabook laptop, as well as the programming language Smalltalk, which you may have heard of, as important in the history of object-oriented programming. And both of these were designed to make computing and programming more accessible to children. And after this foundational research in the 1970s, the adoption of programming, especially Logo, in American schools in the 1980s was largely due to Cold War funding for math, science, and technology initiatives. This was the Beat the Russians initiatives that I felt like I was part of growing up. Kids' literacies with text as well as programming were seen as critical to national defense and health in the 1980s. So this is typified by an American government report from 1983 called Nation at Risk, which was very influential, and it echoed the military interest in literacy and encapsulated some of the anxiety of the Cold War at that time. So it noted that competition from Japan and Korea and Germany in particular, it argued that it threatened America's position in the world and claimed that at the heart of this risk were low literacy levels. So note that the tagline, I don't know if you saw that, the tagline for the Code.org video, and at the end of that they said, in China they teach all of their kids to program, but only 5% of our kids are doing it. It's that same kind of rhetoric, right? Except it's just a different kind of, a different entity that's threatening America's place in the world. And it was in this environment that these programming initiatives were rolled out in elementary schools in the 1980s. In the 1990s, the new World Wide Web drew most of the attention for the Coding for Everyone promotion. So you might recognize Tim Berners-Lee here, and old school HTML, my first heading. The architect of the web, Tim Berners-Lee, insisted on technical and organizational protocols that would make it accessible to and programmable by everyone, and resisted commercializing it, as you may know from the stories of, if you know anything about the web. Although people learned more about code from writing HTML for the web in the 1990s, increased emphasis on software marketing and the still high costs of computing drove a conversation about a material divide. And this was also connected to some copyright cases and patent cases about software in the 1980s, which I'm also happy to talk about if anybody is really interested to talk about software patent law. So getting access to computers was often thought of as more important than programming them. So as long as you could have the computer, this was where computer literacy, this kind of idea of like, can you insert the disk in the machine? Can you use a word processor? Those kinds of ideas of computer literacy, which are very, very different from the Kemeny and Kurtz and Perlis and Kay and Papert vision of what it looks like to have a kind of more deep literacy experience. So in the late 1990s and 2000s, we begin to see investment in languages that were more accessible to beginning programmers, and these languages could circulate around the web, like Python. How many of you guys program in Python? Hey, a lot of people. Okay. So in a 1999 grant application, Guido van Rossum, the designer of the Python programming language, tapped into the positive cultural associations of literacy in order to secure funding for his dream of coding for everyone. So this is something he wrote in this DARPA grant. We compare mass ability to read and write software with mass literacy and predict equally pervasive changes to society. Hardware is now sufficiently fast and cheap to make mass computer education possible. The next big change will happen when most computer users have the knowledge and power to create and modify software. So Python was funded for a year by DARPA. And so again, we see the connection between programming and literacy and national defense. So this brings us up to the contemporary Coding for Everyone campaigns. And these contemporary coding campaigns sometimes talk about preparing people for citizenship. You hear Will.i.am there, right? But they don't connect to the morality associated with mass literacy campaigns. There was none of that kind of moral valence, really, in the Code.org video, right? Instead, they reflect the connection of literacy to production and technology. That is, they resemble our associations with literacy after World War II. And this is perhaps not a historical coincidence, given that computers were really getting, digital computers were really getting up to speed around World War II and after, right? And for these campaigns, knowing how to program means doing something good for your country, but it also means access to employment. If you can program, you can get a job as a programmer. Infographics and statistics on Code.org's website also underscore the imminent employability of people who can program. So here they say computer science is a top paying college degree and computer programming jobs are growing at 2 times the national average. And this particular infographic shows the intertwining national and individual interest in boosting programming education. You can get a job, but you can also help your country by learning to program. So I've just given you a whole bunch of history, right? The history of literacy and the history of how people have promoted programming. And what I find interesting in this, I find lots of things interesting, but what I find interesting for both coding and writing literacy's historical trajectories is that there's a trend towards employment and productivity and away from civic engagement and creativity for both of them. So there are groups and initiatives that buck that trend. Most notably. Around here, Code and Supply, Assemble, if you know that that group too, which pitches quite a bit younger, but is trying to sort of get kids interested in very creative ways about programming and trying to work on diversity initiatives, etc. So, major question: do we want to promote coding for everyone? Right? Do we want to here's this sort of all of these campaigns? Personally, I am excited about that idea for a lot of different reasons, which I'm happy to talk about afterwards if you want to. But in universities and formal schools, I think we can work on teaching computing across the curriculum, so not just in computer science. So right now, for instance, I'm helping to design a major at Pitt that combines computer science and English in a sort of more creative way, so that if you graduate knowing how to program, you don't necessarily need to be a systems engineer, or you can do lots of different things with programming, which I assume many of you know too. And there's a lot of resources coming out that are useful for that. The programming language processing, for instance, is like precisely designed for that. The book Exploratory Programming for the Arts and Humanities by Nick Montfort is very focused on that. So there's just a ton of resources in that direction at that kind of intersection. But there's work to be done outside of formal schooling too. So remember what happened when literacy was tied with formal schooling in the 19th century. And we don't want programming to look like a factory, I don't think. And I think we should be wary of the insertion of corporate-sponsored curricula in public schools. So you think back to the variety of literacies that were valued in the 17th and 18th century before mandated schooling. And for me, personally, to borrow a slogan from the city of Austin, Texas, I think we want to keep coding literacy weird, so it's not all the same thing. I know, it's like a bum joke, right? We want coding to be able to accommodate diverse values, and we shouldn't have everybody going through the exact same training. That means, I think, that we should be teaching coding in places outside of computer science, say in meetup groups and places like this, right? So that was a really fast run through some history and themes from my book and my research. I hope it provided some context for the rhetoric around how everyone should learn to code right now. And when you go back to work this week, if you are going back to work, I wonder if you might think about your work in the context of this history. So, why do you program if you do program? Why do your coworkers program? Why did you learn? Why are you teaching your kids to program? Is it strictly for employment? Does it fulfill a civic obligation for you? Do you find it mind expanding? And do you see connections between your ability and uses of programming and your uses of writing? These are things, hopefully, maybe you can think about. I would be happy to talk with you about it. I would be actually quite excited to talk about this if anybody wanted to talk about it. So thank you very much.